Hey, and welcome to the highlights of episode number 191 with Arthur Haines. Now, some of my favorite parts of this episode were when he talks about nature divorcement and how we can get back in touch and reconnect with nature. I also loved when he shared how to limit blue light and EMF exposure, what is forest bathing and how to do it. Also, I loved when he talked about how to cultivate community and when he shared his thoughts on parenting, co-sleeping, and smacking children. But there is so much more wisdom and inspiration that you get in the full episode. So, to listen to the full podcast and get all the info in the show notes, head on over to melissaambrosini.com/191 right now. Arthur, welcome to the show. I'm so excited to dive in today. Can you tell us about your story and how you got to where you are today doing the work that you now do?
Well, for me, it has become a journey more and more about wanting to have connection to the place where I live. So much of what we do in the world today is really based on kind of a disconnection from a place where we're all attempting to do many of the same kinds of things, no matter what landscape we occur on. And this is sort of the industrial society that we find ourselves in. And I'm just really excited to dive into my local place. And that has come about through the study of botany. I do work as a plant biologist, and through the study of ancestral skills from anyone who will share from anywhere in the world and learning how to apply those skills to this place. There was a time in my life where wild foods were something that you did in a survival situation. And that has slowly become something that occurs to us here on a more daily basis. As I've studied nutrition and ancestral diets more and more, I've come to understand that this is a really important thing that humans need to engage in as much as they can.
So, talk to us about nature divorcement. I find even myself over the past couple of years, I have just been so drawn to getting out into nature, to getting back to nature. So, how important is it that we get back to nature, that we reconnect with Mother Nature?
Well, I think it's becoming known just how important this is now that a lot of researchers are turning their attention toward this. I mean, this idea of nature divorcement, of spending time away from natural habitats. And I describe these places as places where there's lots of cooperative connections between many different species. In other words, there's lots of animals and plants and bacteria, fungi, and so on interacting with each other that create these really complex environments. Nature divorcement is something that I think that people don't always realize how profound it is in humans. Here in the United States, Melissa, 90% is the average amount of time spent indoors by people living in the United States. So the average time is 90% indoors. And this is just an insane amount of time in what I call the constructed environment. It's a less dynamic and a less diverse environment.
I want to get your thoughts on blue light and obviously Wi-Fi and technology. What are some things that we can do to really limit the harmful effects that that EMFs and that blue light have on us? Like, what can we do?
I mean, we take some very simple strategies that many people, if they want to, would be able to participate in. Of course, we make sure that our screens are shifted toward those red and orange wavelengths in the evening, things like flux, because let's face it, we may all like to be wild all the time, but here we are communicating, through a computer system, through the internet, and many of us to some degree need to use computers in our living to earn income, to order the things that we might need for living. And so we're really careful to make sure that our computer screens are following the pattern through the day. They're trending toward blue light during the day to stimulate us to be awake. And then they're going toward those softer lights, those reds and oranges that would be mimicked in, say, moonlight and evening fires Here at the home, we don't use Wi-Fi. We do have internet. It's through a satellite. I need this for my work. I need this to be able to communicate with you now. But what we have done is we simply have a splitter and we wire the computers. And we do that so that we're not emitting EMF through the entire house. And you can even get shielded wiring to make sure that there's no EMF coming off this. We turn things off like this at night. Our phones, we live remote. So the only phones that we can possibly have here are smartphones that are using, a signal as opposed to being a landline, which we don't have access to. And those go on airplane mode at night so that we're trying to create our sleeping chamber. I think you'd really love it, Melissa. My wife and my daughter, we have a room that we sleep in, and this room is wood, floor to ceiling. There's no plastic. We have, you know, organic cotton sheets and wool blankets. These are expensive, but we considered it really important. So we saved our money and put them here rather than into gadgets and other things that we didn't need. There's only one outlet at the far side of this room, so there isn't even electricity in it, and lots of big windows to let that moonlight and starlight be able to come in at night. It's the closest thing to this burrow that you could possibly imagine that is just shielded as much as possible from all of the ways that we light up our rooms, whether it's visible or invisible, spectra that can all disrupt our sleep.
Yes, that sounds like our bedroom. It's literally just beautiful stone floor and then
Mm.
a beautiful American white oak Samina sleep system, which is
hmm
just amazing.
I think I'd like to point out, because I know that because these are expensive, there are many people that often really speak poorly about these kinds of things. And I mean, we spend a third of our life sleeping. And it's really important for our immune system, for our happiness, for our health, to make sure that we're having the best quality sleep possible. And I think people are simply used to just spending next to no money at all and are not reaping the benefits of really high quality sleep. I mean, what we're sleeping on is a natural latex mattress, it's just tree rubber. And we feel that was really important too, to get away from the flame retardants, to get away from the synthetics. And we're on a sleep system that just really benefits us. And I think that people who might immediately jump to being a little critical about the cost of some of these things should consider how much money they have spent for their waking hours, and their sleeping hours are just as important to their health. You mentioned that you have an essential oil diffuser that you use.
Yes.
And this is another thing where there's been research that has looked into forest bathing, which you may have heard of, where people are simply spending time in a forested setting. And one of the things that has come out of this research is the understanding that when we're in wild areas where there are lots of plant species present, they are releasing chemicals, and these chemicals are called phytoncides. And it's a kind of a crazy name, but just think of them as aromatic compounds that are released by the plant that serve as defensive compounds for the plants. The reason I'm mentioning this is because research has shown that these things that we breathe in almost unconsciously, that we are exposed to continuously when we're in a natural setting, are of massive benefit to us. They enhance the functioning of the innate immune system. They have shown that there is greater clarity of thought, that levels of stress hormones decline. Even the people who were exposed to these phytoncides had greater memory function and concentration than those who weren't. And the wonderful thing is, essential oils are a way to be exposed to these things.
You're a massive advocate for returning to our biological norms, especially regarding our diet. So let's talk about that.
Humans, like every other animal on the planet, have biological norms. We have things that we have evolved to, exposures that we can handle, exposures that we can't, kinds of foods that are good for us, kinds of foods that aren't. Many people really believe that humans are capable of transcending their biological norms. But every time we make really drastic changes from what we have evolved to, we see people suffering. And we see them suffer incredible rates of chronic disease, sometimes acute health issues, digestive disorders and gut dysbiosis, altered sleep patterns, depression, suicide, and so on. And it's just really important to recognize that there are things about our diet that we really shouldn't mess around with, to put it in a really blunt way, and that it's important to understand that things like nutrient density and diversity of our diet are just really important. And a lot of dogmatic trends that we see happening right now really stand in contradiction to, our evolved patterns.
What do you mean when you speak about the conscientious omnivore?
Well, I am talking about a person that does not participate in any way, if they can help it, in any kind of factory farming. I'm not talking just about animals, but I'm also talking about plants. For me, the conscientious omnivore is someone who is thinking about where their food is coming from and really trying to do best practice, regardless of whether we're talking animal, fungal, plant, bacterial, that they are trying to get their food from ethical sources.
So important. It's really important. So, another thing you talk a lot about is herbalism and wild foods and foraging. So, can you talk a little bit about the importance of that?
Foraging for wild plants is a place that people can really get involved in wild foods. And I would love your listeners to be aware that there is a large body of research now demonstrating that wild plants, on average, are superior in many ways to the cultivated plants. They tend to have greater levels of vitamins and minerals. They tend to have more fibers and less sugars. And there's always exceptions to some of these things. They tend to have better ratios of essential fatty acids. In other words, they tend to be skewed more toward the omega 3s and less toward the omega 6s that we see in some real grain based diets that are found around the world. And they're also, and really importantly, they are much richer in plant compounds that we call phytochemicals. Wild plants have to fend for themselves. And in doing so, they upregulate these compounds to fend off pathogens, whether they be viruses or fungi, to fend off insect herbivores, sometimes even mammalian herbivores. And many of these compounds turn out to be really valuable to our health. They upregulate our immune system, they fight cancer, they prevent cancer, they benefit our vascular health or our heart, our immune function, and so on and so forth. And one of the big ones is that many of these compounds are anti inflammatory. So they help us fight off those stiff, achy, and arthritic conditions that a lot of people experience later in life on a diet that's very rich in cultivated foods. Now, what's happening is as plants were taken out of the wild for cultivation, we change them. And we change them through breeding to give us greater mass, more sweet flavors and less bitters, which has its own drawbacks to us. Those bitters are often antioxidants and benefit our digestion. But we never look at this breeding for what it is. It's a form of genetic modification that's taken place over many generations. And what we see is plants have lost their phytochemistry, in part through their breeding, and in part because they are tended by humans. When we protect plants from pathogens and from herbivores, the plants don't have to produce the same amount of phytochemistry because we're taking care of that job for them. And unfortunately, we get less of it. And so a very deep reliance on these highly modified foods, foods that have changed very much from their wild progenitor that they were derived from, tends to lead to chronic disease. And that's something that has been shown in the research over and over again.
How can we cultivate more community? Because, I mean, for me, ideally, it would be in a close proximity for where I live, ideally. But maybe that's not the case. I don't know. What can we do? How can we do this?
Well, for me, I find that sometimes what I have to do is I need to find people that I can engage in some of the practices of our ancestral communities. We might not live in the same location, in the same home. We might live an hour apart, but we're going to participate in as many aspects as we can of what historical communities did. So we're going to share resources. That might mean inviting each other over to share wild food meals or meals that have come from the supermarket where everybody feels really good about that food and they understand that what is being shared is a real gift to their health. We might share other things. I have a friend who we share some of our financial resources between us to help each other out. And it obviously, when we're giving and sharing in this way, humans feel amazingly good about this. Find people that you can treat genders and, really importantly, and ages as equal. We are supposed to live in egalitarian cultures where there is this equality throughout. And I think it's really important to find ways to at least get pieces of what human communities had. I mean, the big one, the word community comes from the Latin communis, which refers to things held in common. And the one physical item that was held in common by all of our ancestors was the land. Everybody had agency to be on that land and derive the things they need for survival from that land. And that's really difficult for people to attain today. But these other things that I've mentioned, like sharing resources and treating genders as equal and operating by consensus and without hierarchy, those are things that can be incorporated into a music group, a sports club, anything where there's a group of people that have come together. And in those settings, try to get as much of our ancestral community together as you can.
And you spoke a little bit about children. I want to hear your thoughts on child rearing. Can you talk to us about that?
Well, I will say, Melissa, that the things that we practice here really do stand in stark contrast to the kind of parenting that I received as a child. And I'm not trying to claim that my mother was an evil or vicious person. She was simply practicing what the society at large told her was necessary. For example, we know that when we let children cry it out alone in a room where we're trying to break the connection between infant and mother, that this creates an immensely stressful situation where the that developing brain is being flooded with stress hormones that ultimately impacts IQ in the adult. And evidence shows this. And so that kind of, I mean, my daughter is 5 and we're still co-sleeping. She's afraid of the dark, and there's no amount of rationalization and logical discussion that's going to change that. She's a young person and still an emotional being, and I respect that. And I will be sleeping with my daughter until she decides that she's ready to leave the bed. Striking is simply not something that I'm ever going to do. That's here in the United States, 7 out of 10 parents agree that this is an appropriate thing to do to your child. And it's straight up bullying. It is a larger, physically dominating person using force or the threat of force to change the behavior or to get something that they want. It hitting children as a punishment meets every definition of bullying. And then when they go to school and bully people, they get in trouble for it. And it must be so absolutely confusing to them. If I were to say strike you, I could be arrested for assault. But if I strike my 40-pound daughter, it's considered acceptable.
Mm.
And to me, that is a very warped worldview to be supported by a society. I can't even fathom how that has come to be the case. Another good example, Melissa, is that we treat our child as sovereign. The words alone, they just don't work with someone who's a year and a half, 2, 3 years old, but it's the experiences. So we're really big on letting our child experience the world. And that does mean sometimes that they fall down, that they get hurt, that they get scratched, that they get scared, because that experiential learning is a really key part of human development that is being robbed from people. That's simply not useful. It shields the child from living.